Hello, ladies and gentlemen, it's Timothy here. I am re-evaluating my cards that I picked to be the best of the best for Eldritch Moon. With Kaladesh coming up on us very quickly and Eldritch Moon coming to a close, I figured I would look back and see how I did on evaluating the cards when they come out. I do plan on making a best of the best evaluation when Kaladesh is completely spoiled. And keep in mind, I'm only looking at commons and uncommons here, since those will be the bulk of what you're playing with at pre-release and during your early drafts. I will say some of these colors I missed the mark by a lot, and some of them I did pretty well on, at least in my opinion. And final thing I'll mention is that this is, of course, only my opinion. I know there are pros who have put their opinions in paper, and I know people have their preferences, but these are the cards I now consider to be the best of the best for each color in Eldritch Moon Shadows over Innistrad draft. So, starting off with the green commons, when I initially looked at the set before pre-release started, the two commons I picked out as best green commons were Ulvenwald Captive and Prey Upon, and I'm going to be honest, I stick with these two as the best green commons in the set. The only thing I would really say differently here is that I think Captive is a higher pick than Prey Upon. While I have been a little disappointed with Prey Upon in that it often ends up being a 2-for-1 with a lot of these green creatures having lower toughness than their power, it's still a very good removal spell, a premium removal spell if you're looking for common removal in the color, and it is going to kill things very, very often. So even if you have to 2-for-1 yourself, the fight aspect is still pretty good. It's an effect you want to watch. And Ulvenwald Captive is just very, very good. The defender on the front side doesn't really matter since you're using it for mana anyway. And oftentimes you flip this on turn 6 and you have such a sizable threat. When your mana dork can turn into an actual threat later in the game, it's actually really scary. And keep in mind, that was the point of Delirium on Deathcap Cultivator. They gave it Death Touch in the late game, so it'd be relevant. This just turns into a 4/6, can actually close out the game on its own, which is a lot for your 2-mana common. So I think I nailed it with these two. As far as the honorable mentions go, those are essentially the next two strongest cards in my opinion. When I initially made this video, I called out Bloodbriar and It of the Horde Swarm as my next top green commons. Slightly worse than Ulvenwald Captive or Prey Upon, but still very, very good and not terrible to pick really early on. I do agree that It of the Horde Swarm is probably still one of the best green commons. That is my opinion, of course, and even though it's not traditionally a green card, it's really, really only good in green decks, but in those decks it's pretty decent. Being able to go wide is very effective against a good number of decks and plays very well in this format. It does have some weaknesses in that there are a lot of things that deal damage to 1-toughness creatures, but even the 4/4 body is still pretty decent in this format. Bloodbriar I still believe is a good card, but I think there's another common that I now consider slightly better than it, and that is Backwoods Survivalist. This card is just decent without Delirium and very, very strong if it does have Delirium, making it a pretty useful and versatile card in any green deck, whereas Bloodbriar really only fits in a couple green decks and is really only an all-star occasionally. Most of the time it plays out as a 3-mana 2/3, but I do believe Backwoods Survivalist is a stronger, safer pick in most draft formats. Moving on to the uncommons, not trying to toot my horn here, but I picked Clear Shot and Somberwald Stag as the best uncommons for green, and I'm going to stick by those two. I've been impressed with both of these cards. Clear Shot is, in my opinion, the best uncommon in the set. I know some people pick other cards, but I've never lost a game where I've cast a Clear Shot, and I probably lost every game where Clear Shot has been cast against me. It's very, very strong, very good, awesome with lifelinkers, and just a generally amazing way to start out a draft if you don't pick up your rare. Somberwald Stag was a card that I would have definitely guessed to be really strong, but could see being really weak depending on the format, but it has played out exceptionally well, often just working as a Flame Tongue Kavu or Shriek Maul or whatever you want to call that sort of effect. Very often taking out a smaller creature and staying on the board, and occasionally taking out a bigger creature. Also, with the recursion in this set in black, especially if you're playing green-black, being able to recur Somberwald Stags multiple times and playing them throughout a game is really, really strong. Somberwald Stag was a clear signal that green was open, and that was very, very disappointing in a lot of drafts where I had to pass this card, but would often switch after my first 4 or 5 picks if I saw this card coming late. I will, on the other hand, say that I think I missed the mark on these uncommons here. I picked Gnarlwood Dryad and Kessig Prowler as kind of early game threats that I thought would be really good, and I do believe they are both very strong, but I think there are actually two uncommons here that I would pick over both of these. The first one is Shrill Howler. This card has really impressed me. I'm going to be honest, that 1 toughness is a real burden on your 3 mana cost creature, but that's the same for the other 2 cards I had already listed. If Shrill Howler ever flips and deals damage, I don't see how you lose the game very often. Making a 3/2 every time it connects is great, and just that extra ability, forcing your opponent to actually block with something useful instead of chumping with a 1/1 to kill it off, is really, really great. Not to mention, this was a huge incentive to take the card Waxing Moon and try to get somebody unexpectedly by flipping it in the middle of combat and giving it trample. The other card I would pick over Gnarlwood Dryad and Kessig Prowler is Noose Constrictor. I'll admit, Noose Constrictor is not an overpowered card. It is just a decent uncommon, but what it presents when you play it on turn 2 is a threat that's really, really hard to block profitably. Not to mention it does have the Delirium and Madness enablers tacked into it, although that's not particularly ideal for green. It does come up occasionally. And Noose Constrictor can deal a ton of damage in the late game. I've lost to people just dumping a bunch of cards into Constrictor and hitting me for 5 or 6 damage. It's a good incentive to store up a bunch of lands after you've hit the number of lands you need to make your deck function, and the fact that your common 2-drop can also close out a game, similar to Ulvenwald Captive, seems like it definitely deserves a spot in the top uncommons for green. Moving on to red, I picked Vildenpack Outcast and Brazen Wolves as the best commons in this set. And I'm going to be honest, my personal bias are going to show here. I think Vildenpack Outcast deserves to be knocked down just a little bit of a notch in favor of another card, so I'm going to do some switching here, but I honestly believe Brazen Wolves deserves one of the top spots here. The card that I'm replacing Vildenpack Outcast with is Galvanic Bombardment, but I'm going to be honest, I think Brazen Wolves and Galvanic Bombardment are very, very close for red commons. It's my understanding that a lot of people believe Galvanic Bombardment is not just the best red common, but the best common in the set, and I'm going to be dead serious. I do not believe that. I think given the two, I would often pick Brazen Wolves before I pick Galvanic Bombardment, and I think most people would say that's a mistake, but my personal successes with Brazen Wolves have been much, much higher than they have been with the Bombardment. The Bombardment is really good in red-blue spells, which is probably one of the top-tier limited decks you can make in this format, but Galvanic Bombardment will not win you the game. It is super efficient, though, and I think it does deserve to be in the top 2, but my opinion, personally, I think these cards are closer than most people would have them, nor do I believe Galvanic Bombardment is the strongest card in the set, or strongest common in the set. Brazen Wolves, in my opinion, is just super busted for a common, dealing tons of damage if your opponent can't deal with it right away. With that being said, I had originally picked Alchemist Greetings and the Bombardment as the cards I considered next in line. Obviously, I've moved Galvanic Bombardment up, but I've replaced it with Vildenpack Outcast, just kind of thinking that the Bombardment usually is a little bit better earlier in the game and does a little bit more efficiently than the Outcast, but I do believe the Outcast is a card that a lot of people neglect to pay attention to and then lose to it very often. The backside of this card is ridiculous for a common, able to close out a game very, very easily. Red is really good in this format, but it lacks finishers. Vildenpack Outcast is exactly what you're looking for. I've seen pros do drafts online where they're drafting red and they completely neglect to even look at this card, and that shocks me. I think Vildenpack Outcast deserves one of these spots. Alchemist Greeting is a good card, but it's really only at its peak if you can Madness it. If you are playing a deck that can't take advantage of Madness or you don't have the enablers, it gets a lot worse, and for that reason I'm replacing it with Thermo Alchemist, a card that wasn't even on my radar when I originally made the list. Thermal Alchemist just does so much damage throughout the course of a game, and again, red-blue is such a strong archetype in this format that Thermal Alchemist just goes nuts in those sorts of decks with people playing multiples of it. I think after the first couple drafts of Eldritch Moon, people started first, second, third pick in Thermo Alchemists, where originally it would go almost last in the pack, and I think it is a solid card. I don't think it's better than Brazen Wolves, in my honest opinion, because it's never going to attack, and there are some decks that just don't want a card like that. I would always pick Brazen Wolves over Alchemists, unless I was playing red-blue, and then I would specifically be looking for the Alchemists instead. Uncommons, well, red has some really strong uncommons, let's just throw that out there. My initial picks were Incendiary Flow and Savage Alliance, both very, very good cards. I'm going to knock Incendiary Flow down a little bit here, to be honest. Savage Alliance, I believe, deserves a top spot. I've heard a lot of people say this is the best uncommon in the set, and I think it's definitely in the top 3, but I think I would take Clear Shot over Savage Alliance in most cases, not all the time. First pick, first pack. Incendiary Flow I would often first pick as well, but I think another card trumps it here. That is Smoldering Werewolf. So if you look at Savage Alliance, what it really represents is killing a mid-sized creature and also killing a bunch of other 1 toughness creatures, which again, 1 toughness is a huge liability for a creature in this format because there's so many ways to deal with it. Savage Alliance can easily get 2, 3 for 1s, and I've never really seen the trample thing be relevant, but it is there, and it says a lot for a card where you're not even using the full potential, and it's a very, very powerful card as is. The same goes for Smoldering Werewolf here, which has the ability to come down, knock off potentially 2 creatures, or even just kill 1, getting a lot of value off of it, and then once it transforms, your opponent's done for. It attacks, deals 2 to target creature or player, potentially hitting for 8 damage or clearing a blocker out of the way. It's absolutely insane, and the flip cost is very reasonable, 6 mana, not to mention that 2 toughness is way more than 1 in this format, so the Smoldering Werewolf is much more likely to live. For the 2 extra turns you need to flip it, it definitely deserves one of the top spots. I've played with this card a lot, and I think it's insanely good. My honorable mentions were originally Spread in Flames and the Werewolf. I'm just going to swap the Werewolf here, but I do believe Spread in Flames is not as good as I originally thought it would be. So Incendiary Flow still deserves to be on this list, and that says a lot for red when a card like Incendiary Flow, which is very, very good, doesn't make it into the top uncommon spot. Spread in Flames, however, while being still a pretty good card, is a little disappointing. There have been times where I've gotten up to 7 mana and killed maybe 2 things off of this, which is not where I want to be for my 7 mana instant card. The card looks really good, sometimes it overperforms, but against blue decks and decks of those natures where a lot of your creatures are 3 toughness and above, the card just doesn't pan out as well as it should. So for that reason, I'm replacing it with Weaver of Lightning, a card I've been super impressed with. Maybe something I didn't think was inherently strong in this format, but having a super relevant ability on an actually decent blocker, in addition to reach on a red creature, is just a very, very good and efficient combination of spells. Combining Weaver of Lightning with effects like Borrowed Malevolence, and just being able to kill 2 toughness creatures for the price of 1, for the same effects as you would normally just kill a 1 toughness creature, seems really, really good for your uncommon. I actually think Weaver of Lightning is a very high pick. Alright, moving right along to black. How did I do on black? The commons I originally stated as best of the best are Boon of Emrakul and Succumb to Temptation. So, let's see. This is probably one of the biggest landslides here. Boon of Emrakul, in my opinion, probably the best common, black common in the set. Black does suffer from having kind of weaker commons and having particularly strong uncommons, but dropping off after a certain point. With that being said, Succumb to Temptation is a card I don't even really like to play anymore. I'm never super disappointed to have 1 in my deck, but it's not a card I'm ever scrambling to have, and I've noticed people are really down on it as well. It just doesn't play out as well as I would hope it would. I think Olivia's Dragoon, again, maybe a controversial pick, but Olivia's Dragoon is exactly what I'm looking for a lot of decks, especially if I'm in black. I end up with cards like Weirded Vampire, I end up with cards like Twins of Mauer Estate, and I need a reliable way to madness them, and if I can madness them on turn 3, I'm a huge favorite to win a game. Olivia's Dragoon lets you do that while also providing itself with evasion, making it an actual threat throughout the game as well. I think the card plays very, very well, and a lot of times doesn't deal a ton of damage, but what it does for the decks it's in is exactly what you're looking for in those decks. And the fact that there aren't as many Madness Enablers in Eldritch Moon means that this is a very high pick for your red-black decks or your black-green decks. It's a very solid common. Honorable mentions went to Gavany Unhallowed and Certain Death. I recall saying Gavany Unhallowed was kind of a speculative pick here, that I wasn't sure how strong it would be, and I think the card's solid but not super impressive. Certain Death, on the other hand, is a card that I think has definitely stood up to its name. These kind of 6-mana sorcery or instant speed kill spells are usually pretty good, and I've been impressed with Certain Death. It just lets you get back in some games, and sometimes I've found myself, if I'm playing a deck that has Certain Death, I just want to top deck it at certain points, which is usually a good sign that that card's very good. It does drop off in multiples, so I don't think I'd ever play more than 2 in a deck, and even 2 might be pushing it. But I give the nod to Certain Death here still. Gavany Unhallowed, probably getting booted off this list. I just think it is a good card, but not super impressive. Midnight Scavengers, I believe, deserves to be on this list somewhere, and it is probably close between Olivia's Dragoon and Scavengers. It's often a 2-for-1, and the fact that you can usually pick up the Graph Rats to go with it makes this an actual really strong threat. I've won games with Chitter and Host before. I've lost games to Chitter and Host, and that says a lot about the common. It is a sign, if you play a Graph Rats, that you have one of these in your deck, but that doesn't necessarily mean your opponent can play around it optimally. I think I did much better on the uncommons than I did with the commons. In this case, I called Murder and Abundant Maul as the best black uncommons in the set. And again, Abundant Maul, not necessarily a black card, but really, really much worse if you're not playing it in a black deck. Murder, well, I don't think anyone's arguing. I'm going to stick with it. I think Murder is the best black uncommon in the set. If I had to pick top 3 uncommons total, I would pick Clearshot, Murder, and Savage Alliance. And honestly, I don't really know how I'd rank them. I'd probably rank Clearshot first, followed by Savage Alliance, followed by Murder. But anytime I've had a Murder in my deck, I definitely did everything I could to play it. Or my pool, not my deck. Abundant Maul is still going to be on this list, spoiler alert, but I think it's going to get knocked down a bunch. And I think people actually respect the Abundant Maul now. My first 3 drafts in Eldritch Moon all had Abundant Maul in them because they wheeled or they came really, really late. What happens now is I don't even see the card past the 2nd or 3rd pick. But with that being said, I'm knocking up Ruthless Disposal to the top uncommon spot. This card is incredibly good. It got even better once I realized that you can always target one of your own creatures, even the creature that you are attempting to sacrifice, meaning that you never have to lose 2 creatures for this effect, and you can use it as a 2-for-1 on your opponent if you really need to kill something. But the reason I'm giving Ruthless Disposal the nod and the notch up here is because it gets you out of certain situations that no other card in this set can. Sometimes your opponent makes a huge threat, or they've got some huge flyers, or something you just cannot kill, where Murder might actually not do the trick. You might not be able to kill just one creature and live. Ruthless Disposal does give you an out in a lot of situations, and I'm never disappointed to have the card in my deck, despite all of the costs and hoops you have to run through to make the card work optimally. Haunted Dead and Ruthless Disposal are my original picks for 2nd to 3rd best, or I'm sorry, 3rd and 4th best uncommons in the set, and I'm kind of sticking where I am here. I think Haunted Dead is particularly good. The power level of black uncommons really drops off after these 4 cards, and I am going to keep Abundant Maul on this list, just knock it down a little because I think it is a little bit worse than Ruthless Disposal. But Haunted Dead is a strong card. The recursion's really nice. The discard outlet is really nice in black. It just does a lot of different stuff while providing you with actually reasonable bodies. And Abundant Maul, for the reasons I just mentioned above, is a pretty good card. The toughness on it is a little bit lacking, but it does give you a really strong enter the battlefield trigger, and it gives black a way to interact with the Emerge deck outside of just opening a Distended Mindbender. Being the only 2 black Emerge creatures in the format, I think they both play very well, and Abundant Maul is an uncommon option if you don't get the Mindbender. Blue is next on the mark, and I'm gonna just be truthful from the beginning here. Blue and white, I might have messed up a little bit here. I originally said Exultant Cultist and Ingenious Scab were the best blue commons. I'm not saying these cards are bad. I think having played the format as much as I have now, I do believe there are 2 different cards that I would pick going out of the format than going into the format. The best commons, in my opinion, are Dragunder and Wretched Griff. I have no idea how I missed Wretched Griff on this list at all. Spoiler alert, he's not in the honorable mentions. But Wretched Griff is hands down one of the best blue commons in this set. It's a very clear sign that blue is open. It's good in a number of decks while also being castable outside of blue decks. 7 mana still being a decent card, but the emerge is really, really good. And that 6 mana emerge is very, very strong for a common, allowing you to curve really, really nicely into the card from your 3-drop into your Wretched Griff and still have mana open. Particularly great, and replacing itself while providing a pretty sizable flyer is really nice. Dragunder, a card that kind of went under the radar. I figured the card would be okay, but I didn't figure it would be as good as it is. It actually just plays really, really well. It's a little bit clunky sometimes, but I've seen it work wonders. It's very good in the red-blue deck, which I've mentioned before, and it's just a generally good card altogether. I think I would pick it very, very highly, and I would take it as a sign that blue is open. Originally, I picked Spontaneous Mutation and Take Inventory as my top blue commons. I think Take Inventory does not deserve to be anywhere near this list. In fact, I don't think I've cast a single Take Inventory in all of my Eldritch Moon drafts. I just don't think the card is good. I found that when I start taking them early, the rest don't come to me, and I found that when I take them late, they're just wasted picks because I don't want to take any early in the next couple packs. Honestly, if you're a risk taker, Take Inventory might be a little bit better for you, since you might be willing to take them a lot higher, but I prefer to take them late, and if it works out, it works out, but it's never really worked out for me. So Take Inventory is not staying on this list, but I will allow Spontaneous Mutation to keep the throne here, or at least the third or fourth best common throne, if that's a thing, because it does play very well in a number of different decks. It doesn't work as removal, but it does its best impression of a blue pacifism at instant speed, being super efficient and locking down a threat if you can't find another way to remove it. What replaces Take Inventory? Well, Ingenious Scab does need to be on the list still. Maybe a little bit worse than Dragunder, maybe definitely worse than Wretched Griff, while still being a very solid common. I guess I can say this for every red and blue card that I've picked, but very good in the red-blue spells deck. It is a zombie in the blue-black decks, and it's just a very good beater. I've lost a lot of games to this thing, and it's actually a really scary threat on turn 3. The thing that pushes it over the top is the prowess, just threatening to be able to pump it with open mana, while also threatening to cast a spell and pumping it, makes it really difficult to block it favorably. Blue uncommons, well, let's just take a moment here. Blue uncommons are really, really good in this set. I had to narrow it down to 4, obviously, the top uncommons, the top honorable mentions, but there's still maybe 2 or 3 that would be very, very close on the honorable mentions. I'm sticking with my guts here. Advanced Stitchwing is a very underrated card. It wins games, it does blue stuff, it flies, it's a huge body, it has recursion, and honestly, the recursion comes up more often than you would think it would, while also giving you Madness Enablers in blue, which also comes up relevantly. It's a very good card, and people do not respect how strong it is based on how late I'm seeing them in the packs, even at the end of this format. Same goes for Drownyard Behemoth. I'll easily first pick this card if I don't see one of the other top uncommons in a pack or have a particularly poor rare. The card just gets something. It often kills a creature, and it often just bashes afterwards, having a huge body, a huge toughness on it, and just dealing tons of damage. The problem with Drownyard Behemoth, because it does have a weakness, is that it's a very expensive emerge creature and takes a little bit to get down, or requires you to sacrifice something a little bit bigger than you might. But I think the emerge deck is really strong, and I think Drownyard Behemoth is a really strong card. Probably my favorite emerge creature aside from Lashlead Lurker, but still, maybe I can see people being argumentative about the Behemoth. I think it's very good, but I could have a debate with somebody about a different card being in its spot. The honorable mentions I originally named were Scour the Laboratory and Geist of the Archives. So how did I do there? I think Geist of the Archives deserves a spot on this list. It doesn't look inherently powerful, but I've never been disappointed to draw it. I've had multiples of them in drafts before. I've played against them, and it just does everything you want in a solid blue creature. It makes your draws much better, and in the course of a game, it doesn't die very often, so it's going to essentially fix your draws for a good 4 or 5 turns, potentially till the end of the game. Your opponent doesn't really want to spend their removal on a 0/4 unless they're a hyper aggro deck, and if they don't, they're not getting through it anytime soon. It blocks exceptionally well against most things. The Scry ability is what you play it for, though, and it works really, really well. Also, being a spirit makes it relevant for certain other cards, which, you know, Nebelgast Herald, maybe. Scour the Laboratory, unfortunately, has not played out the way I thought it would. I've often been past the card second to last or last, and while I don't think it's unplayable, and I don't think it should be a last pick, it's difficult for blue to achieve Delirium a lot of times, depending on the type of blue build you're playing, and the card just doesn't work very often. Never being disappointed, but not particularly strong either. Nebelgast Herald, in my opinion, is very good. I do take it as a sign that blue is open, and I think it works particularly well in a lot of different builds. Blue-white obviously being the best home for it, since you can capitalize on spirits. The reason I give Nebelgast Herald the nod over cards like Unsubstantiate or Vexen Scuttler or even Grizzled Angler is because those cards are a lot more replaceable and a lot better in very specific builds, whereas Nebelgast Herald is going to be good in almost any blue deck. Locking down blockers, locking down attackers, comboing with other spirits, and if you've ever played multiple Nebelgast Heralds back to back, they work very, very well with each other. The only thing that might make me knock it down again is the 1 toughness, which is a huge liability, but still doesn't stop the Nebelgast Herald from being one of my top picks here. And then finally, white. White was hard for me to evaluate going into the set. White is very weird. A lot of people think it's terrible. A lot of people think it's really strong. I happen to draft white decks pretty often here, and I found that white works really well as a secondary color. Maybe not your best color, but it complements the other colors particularly well. The commons I originally picked were Desperate Sentry and Choke and Restraints. There's no way that Desperate Sentry is still one of the top commons in my opinion. I will say Choke and Restraints has proved itself and actually gone beyond my expectations here. The reason is pacifism effects are still good even at 3 mana. You play this, if it didn't have that exile ability, it would still be great, and having multiples in my deck never feels bad. The exile clause is relevant. Getting that extra card type in your graveyard for Delirium has proven to be relevant in a number of games, and as you'll see in a second, it combos really well with another card in white. Desperate Sentry, very disappointed with how this card played out. I don't think the aggro white decks are Delirium-based decks. That's more of a long game strategy. And while this is a 3-drop that does have a lot of value in it, I don't think it's particularly strong either. And in fact, I tend to not even draft the card anymore. I don't think it's particularly amazing. So I'm giving that position to Sigardan Priest, which this is probably the card I missed the most going into this set. I don't know what it is, but when I see tappers, I don't particularly value them highly until I play the format. This is very similar to a card from Oath of the Gatewatch, I believe, Blinding Drone, which is very, very similar, has a very similar downside to it, but is also just proven to be a very strong card. Sigardan Priest is very strong here, and I don't think I had it anywhere on this list going into the format, so apologies on that one. It definitely deserves one of the top common spots here. I will say I think Choke and Restraints is usually a better pick than it, because Sigardan Priest does have the downside of not being able to tap humans, and I have found that to be relevant in a ton of games before, both in my favor and against my opponents. So keep that in mind, that I do think Choke and Restraints is slightly better, but I'm never super disappointed taking an early Sigardan Priest either. Honorable mentions, Fiendbinder and Steadfast Cathar. No thank you. I think these cards are both fine, and they're much, much better in green-white human strategies, but they're very replaceable, not particularly amazing at what they do, but just solid cards for white decks. I'm going to go ahead and replace those with, first off, Ironclad Slayer, which looks like it may not be a great card, and I realize the power toughness here might be getting cut off at the bottom of the Crazy, so if you can't see that, let me know in the comments below. I think it's getting cut off, but At any rate, Ironclad Slayer is just so good with Choke and Restraints and Boon of Emrakul in white-black or white-X decks that it has to get a mention on this list. And it's never embarrassing either. It is a 3-mana 3/2. It hits hard. It's a human. It does a lot of different things in a lot of different shells, and I think it deserves one of these top spots. They go very, very late, and I don't think they should. I think they should be being snatched up by the people who are taking the Choke and Restraints. The other common I'll mention is Borrowed Grace, and honestly, I'm not a huge fan of these sorts of wide pump effects, but when they're at instant speed, they're much, much better, and the Escalate here has been relevant. Oftentimes, you can use this to win a combat and keep a bunch of your creatures alive that otherwise would have died if this was just a cheaper +2/+0 instead of a potential +2/+2. Not to mention, you can just win games with this sort of effect very often, and that has been a relevant way to use this card throughout the format. So Borrowed Grace has gone way, way up in my opinion. I'm actually really excited and actively seeking this card in a lot of drafts. You know when you want a Borrowed Grace in your deck, and you're super disappointed if you don't get one, which usually tends to tell me that is a strong common to be on the lookout for. Finally, white uncommons. White is another color that has a lot of very good uncommons. I originally called Subjugator Angel and Blessed Alliance the best uncommons in the set, and I'm definitely sticking with Subjugator Angel. This is a huge bomb in my opinion. It wins games almost all the time when it comes down. Sometimes it doesn't, depending on what the board state looks like, but it is a mirror breaker. It is a creature that can break up a board stall and help you push through for victory. It does its best impression of Magmatic Chasm without being a particularly bad card in a lot of matchups, and it's just a decent sized flyer. It's expensive, but 6 mana is what you pay to win the game. Blessed Alliance, still a very good card, but I think I'm going to knock it down a notch here in favor of Faith Unbroken. I'm going to, just voice my opinion here and say that I don't think Faith Unbroken is as good as people give it credit for. People seem to think that they would definitely take this over cards like Murder and Savage Alliance, and I think that's incorrect. I don't think it even would take it over Clear Shot. If I were playing white-green, I would take Clear Shot over Faith Unbroken any day. Faith Unbroken, but the card is still very good despite being a little bit worse than I think people give it credit for, because it does lead to 2-for-1s. It is easy to play around, but when you can't play around it, it just gets you. And the reason I think that it's a little worse than people give it credit for is because of how many bounce spells and kill spells there are in this format. It's really easy to just get a 2-for-1, get your creature back, and stop your opponent from getting any sort of boost off of it. But again, they have to have that card in order for this to be a 2-for-1, and if not, you're just going to lose to Faith Unbroken. The uncommons I originally mentioned were Faith Unbroken and Extricator of Sin. I've knocked Faith Unbroken up just a tiny little bit, and I think Extricator of Sin still deserves to be on this list. It's very close between Extricator and something like Courageous Outrider. I do think Courageous Outrider is a good card, but when I've played Extricator of Sin, I've been very impressed with it. If I can ever get it to flip, the card just takes over the game, the backside of it. Extricator of Flesh, it's a very, very good card on the back. It's not amazing on the front, but it is 2 bodies for the price of 1. The only downside to it, and the only thing stopping it from being really, really high pick, is that if you try to curve into it on turn 3, you're often losing a land to it, and that sets you back quite a bit. But the card is solid on the front side and very, very good on the back side. For that reason, I think it deserves to keep its spot here. Faith Unbroken, I'm simply replacing with Blessed Alliance. I really like Blessed Alliance. I think it deserves to be knocked down just a little bit because of how hard it can be to make your opponent sacrifice a relevant creature in certain decks. But the potential on this card is really good. The 4 life is relevant. The untap ability has been relevant a lot, especially against effects like Sleep Paralysis and Chill and Grasp, Fogwalker, and things like that. And the sacrifice and attacking creature just gets a lot of opponents. It's a card that people forget about, and when they're trying to think of what cards they need to play around, they often just glance over Blessed Alliance in favor of cards like Silver Strike and Tenacity and things like that. But Blessed Alliance has the potential to be a huge blowout while never being a particularly bad card in the instances where you can't quite get the effect you want off of them. So with all that being said, first off, I appreciate you watching these videos. I appreciate you checking back in to see how I did on these drafts. And I'm going to ask you now, how did I do? Do you agree with my top commons and uncommons? And if you don't, tell me what your top picks are in Eldritch Moon. If you think I completely missed the mark, let me know. And if you think I did a pretty good job the first time through, let me know as well. Again, these are just my opinions. I've played a lot of this set, easily 3 to 4 drafts per week. And I have definitely waffled around on what I originally thought and what I think now, but I think it is worth going back and evaluating things, especially with a new set coming out in Kaladesh, where I intend to do this type of video again. It's important to see how my opinion has changed throughout the course of a particular format. So again, comment below. Let me know what your top picks are. Let me know what you think of my top picks. Like, comment, and subscribe as always. Thank you again for watching. My name's Timothy, and I will see you all next time.